Today's presentation is on understanding the measurement and verification process for energy performance contracting in public housing. My name is Dick Santangelo. I'm founder and president of Apollo Engineering Solutions. AES is an energy and facilities consulting firm to the housing industry. Before AES, I was the HUD manager for public housing's energy performance contracting program. I also served as the program manager in the Real Estate Assessment Center for HUD's physical inspection program. This EPC series contains 8 short presentations focused on the available incentives for operating subsidies in public housing. The vignettes will help PHAs in developing the knowledge and skill sets needed to better understand EPCs and to help PHAs to review and request various EPC incentives on HUD's Form 52722 and the 52723 during the annual operating fund process. The focus of this training is on how to measure and verify the energy savings from performance contracting for PHAs. Most PHAs use either an option A, which is a form of short-term equipment measurements and stipulated usage factors to calculate consumption savings, or option C, which relies upon utility consumption baselines and monitoring future utility meter consumptions to compute consumption savings. HUD has specific requirements for measuring and monitoring the savings from both option A and C. I will describe the major savings performance risks for EPC projects, especially in public housing. I will explain the differences between the risks associated with option A and option C. I will also provide insights into what a good measurement and verification plan is and how to manage the plan to maintain savings performance. Measurement and verification requires the collection of data on building equipment, utility consumption and costs, and analysis of that data to determine basically how the equipment is performing. Today, we will cover the key information needed for HUD and PHA documents and more details on how the M&V options for savings measures occur. We will also provide instructions on how to calculate savings for various M&V options. The primary purpose of measurement and verification is to measure the changes in future utility consumption and cost. HUD has specific requirements for how to measure and verify savings to qualify for specific operating subsidy incentives, which will be the subject of other presentations in this series of vignettes. Measurement and verification are used to monitor the ESCo's contractual performance for the financial savings guarantee it provides to the PHAs. To effectively evaluate equipment performance, you must monitor and sometimes measure the conditions of equipment savings equipment. The M&V data have significant economic value, which affects the operating subsidy incentives cash flow between the PHA and HUD, and the savings guarantee cash flow between the PHA and the ESCo. Annual utility consumption baselines provide the basis for option C measurement and the verification approach. Utility baselines are an agreed upon annual utility consumption for a main building utility meter. Option A uses a sample of specific equipment performance parameter measurements to estimate an average baseline rate of use for that equipment parameter. That average rate of use must be multiplied by an approved usage factor to create a consumption baseline for that equipment type. A baseline is a standard of comparison which, like a ruler, is used to measure performance. The baseline should be accurate, or you cannot measure consumption savings with any reasonable confidence. Measurement and verification has 4 key purposes. One is to track the reductions in future avoided utility consumptions and cost. A second and more critical purpose for PHAs is to collect the data needed to calculate the energy performance contracting HUD incentives. A third purpose is to track the contractual guaranteed performance of the ESCo. And the last purpose is to monitor the equipment condition and performance, which is required by both the ESCo contract and HUD. Features that define a good M&V plan are the utility baselines have been accurately defined and approved by HUD. Savings calculations are well defined and approved by HUD. Existing equipment and the proposed changes to that equipment have been completely described. A strategy for monitoring significant changes to equipment over time is defined, and methods for measuring the changes in utility consumption and utility costs are clearly defined. Let's stop for a minute and review some topics that we've discussed. We will do this throughout the presentation to reinforce key principles. So true or false, measurement and verification inspections can help identify equipment performance problems. And the answer to that is true. Among other benefits we discussed, M&V inspections can help identify equipment performance problems. Once M&V data is collected, they will be used to calculate project savings annually during the term of the contract. The data will also monitor changes in utility consumption and the utility cost per unit of consumption. There may be adjustments to the baseline, some that may be approved by HUD and others that are permitted by the performance contract between the ESCo and the PHA, but are not necessarily approved by HUD. This can cause differences in the savings calculated by the ESCo and HUD. Several factors determine the annual cost for M&V. One of the most important is the HUD M&V requirements, which are not negotiable. The best perspective to take about M&V is that it is like risk management. It is wise to spend money on M&V if it will cost effectively allow you to reduce the risk of lost savings performance. Other factors that drive the cost of M&V are how many utility bills you need to track for utility consumption, the required number of sample spot measurements of equipment made, and the number of baseline adjustments which need to be documented for HUD and/or PHA approval. One of the key things that an ESCo M&V plan does is define the main utility baselines in the savings calculation process. Neither the ESCo nor the PHA can control future utility rates. Therefore, the ESCo contracts will typically establish a contract rate for future utility costs. This is typically based upon current rates at the time that the contract is executed, multiplied by an annual inflation factor agreed to by the PHA. This is sometimes known as the floor rate, where the ESCo will use this rate to calculate the future value of utility savings unless the future unit cost of utilities is higher than the floor rate, in which the ESCo may use that rate. Also, the ESCo M&V plan will specifically define if it is using an option A M&V approach, what equipment performance parameters will be measured, and what equipment usage factors are stipulated and approved by HUD. From a contractual viewpoint, the most important performance requirement of an ESCo contract is the savings guarantee the ESCo provides to the PHA. This guarantee imposes a financial liability on the ESCo if it fails to meet the savings guarantee. So what factors can cause an ESCo to adjust the savings calculations under its contract with the PHA? Well, one of the most obvious changes are the utility rates. For some weather-sensitive equipment loads like heating, there may be a baseline adjustment for weather variations. If the level of occupancy in units varies significantly over time, you may adjust for water consumption since vacant units will not consume water at the rates that occupied units will. If there are significant changes by the PHA to the operation and maintenance of the equipment, that could also affect savings, which may require an adjustment to the savings. One of the most significant risks to savings for PHA and ESCos are utility meter changes to the water meter in large multifamily buildings. The reason for this is that old water meters run slow over time and may under-record the actual level of consumption by significant amounts. If data from such a meter was used to define the baseline from a building, and that meter then changed out, it may record more accurately a higher level of consumption. The meter change is not caused by the ESCo or the PHA, but can have a negative economic effect on both if a baseline adjustment is not approved. Action needed to be taken to document the relative accuracy of the old meter compared to the new meter to appropriately adjust the savings must be approved by HUD. So let's have another knowledge check. True or false? New utility meters can be more accurate than old utility meters and can show increased consumption when replaced. The answer to that is true, as we just discussed. Under the topics of factors that can affect savings, new utility meters can be more accurate than old utility meters and record higher consumptions. When ESCos calculate their contract-defined savings, they will use adjusted baselines and contract rates and utility consumption data and the stipulated consumption savings. The ESCo guarantees fewer savings than they expect the project to produce to create a safety margin for them for their savings guarantee to the PHA. This differs from how HUD calculates energy performance savings. HUD will only use approved utility baselines, including HUD-approved adjustments. They rely on actual annual utility consumption and average annual utility cost. They may also use HUD-approved stipulated consumption savings amounts. HUD also relies more heavily on calculations in the HUD forms and incentive regulations. By using different baselines and different utility rates to calculate savings, HUD savings calculations will differ from the ESCo contract calculations in terms of the value of the annual savings. When HUD determines the actual operating subsidy incentives based on its calculations of savings and project costs, there are additional limitations on the values of the incentives which the PHAs will receive. This will be discussed in other video presentations on the specific incentives. Another reason savings calculation may differ between HUD and the ESCo are data entry and calculation errors, which could be made by either the PHA and or the ESCo. Time for another knowledge check. True or false question. ESCo's verified utility savings are the same as HUD verified utility savings. And as we discussed, the answer to this is false. ESCo's and HUD calculated savings often vary due to variation in utility rates, weather adjustments, and or contractual language. Common savings performance risks for EPC projects in PHAs are changes in utility meters, equipment performance issues, occupancy rate changes, and significant changes in utility rates. Earlier, when I discussed baseline adjustments, one I did not mention is new equipment loads added to an existing utility baseline where the baseline has not been adjusted to account for that new load. Another one I didn't mention is changes in building use. There are three possibilities here. The buildings could be demolished. The building could be disposed of or acquired by another entity. The purpose for which the building is used can be dramatically changed. PHA staff have primary responsibility for monitoring these changes, which they must report to HUD and their ESCo partner. I will describe the option A method for measuring and verifying savings for the add-on subsidy incentive. This method focuses on specific energy or water using equipment, which has a well-defined usage factor. For example, how many hours a day a light fixture is on, or how many daily uses per occupant there are for a toilet. To determine savings, random sample spot measurements are taken of specific equipment performance parameters. So for lighting, there may be a kW per fixture, or for toilets, it could be a gallon per flush. Based on the measured performance parameter and approved usage factor, savings are stipulated based on change in sample average equipment measurements. Over time, there are periodic visual inspections to monitor equipment conditions and spot measurements of performance parameters to verify continuing equipment performance. The option A approach focuses the saving analysis on the equipment consumption not building utility meter consumption. You may ask, why use option A to calculate savings? Not all savings can be accurately measured by a utility meter. Sometimes savings are too small to accurately measure with a building level meter. If equipment has a high probability of producing savings over time, more expensive methods may not necessarily be cost effective. HUD has specific requirements for option A with an add-on subsidy. You must measure a random sample of the equipment performance parameters before the equipment is changed. A performance parameter is the rate of equipment utility use over a short period of time. Then you must measure the same performance parameter immediately after the new equipment is installed. Every year thereafter, a random sample of the equipment must be inspected to verify proper operation of the equipment. M&V requirements for resident paid utility incentives are very similar, except annual equipment inspections are not required. Every fifth year, a random sample of the equipment performance parameter must be measured for both the add-on subsidy and the resident paid utility incentive. If the required saving is not achieved based on these required equipment performance measurements, savings will be adjusted, and then instead of every fifth year, measurements will be required annually going forward in the contract. Time for another quick knowledge check. True or false? HUD requires annual operation verification of equipment for option A for the add-on incentive. The answer to that question is true. Annually, HUD requires inspections to ensure that the proper equipment is installed and the equipment is performing to specifications. HUD requirement for operation A or option A, M and V for resident paid utilities are the same as the add-on subsidy, except that the ESCo does not have to perform an annual physical inspection of random sample of the equipment. To implement option A, HUD has sample size requirements for how many pieces of equipment must be measured. These requirements are based on a random sample of equipment units using a statistically valid formula for the confidence and precision of the savings point estimate. The value of the estimated savings point is not the actual average value, but is reasonably close. HUD defines a reasonably close as an 80% probability that the actual average savings value is within plus or minus 10% of the savings point estimate. The confidence interval defined by the plus or minus 10% of the savings point estimate is called the precision level. When these sample performance measures are taken, if there is a 10% difference between the HUD approved consumption savings and the measured savings determined by the ESCo measurements, then the ESCo will be required to adjust the savings to reflect the current measured values. Time for another knowledge check, another true and false question. If option A savings in units changes by 5%, then the PHA needs to adjust the stipulated consumption savings. The answer to that question is false. The stipulated savings are the HUD approved stipulated savings for specific utility types during the contract. However, if there is a difference between the estimated consumption as approved by HUD and the consumption savings from the sampling immediately after the installation of over 10% on average, the ESCo must adjust its stipulated consumption savings and associated RPU allowances to reflect as a percentage the average difference in savings between the existing stipulated savings and the savings determined by the sampling data results. Any changes to the stipulated consumption savings must be discussed in the annual M&V report that the PHA transmits to HUD. If sampling consumption values are less than or equal to 10% on average, then no change to the existing stipulated consumption savings are to be made. To create a building level utility meter baseline, multiple years of utility data are required to calculate a represented annual average consumption value. When you look at these years of data, it is important to consider whether any one-time events may have increased or decreased consumption that are unlikely to happen in the future. An example of this is that if a major piece of equipment is out of service for an extended period of time, then the consumption associated with that equipment will be missing from part of the baseline analysis period. Another example would be extreme weather event, which resulted in loss of power for an extended period of time. One-time events like these examples should be accounted for during the baseline analysis period. Another key baseline consideration is to correctly identify actual equipment loads on the building meter. I've seen cases where there were loads from adjacent buildings that did not belong to the PHA, which were connected to a PHA meter. When is it a good idea to use option C baseline for measuring avoided utility costs? When the utility savings are large enough to accurately measured by the building level meter. When savings are too small, say less than 15% of the total baseline consumption, then there is limited ability to accurately measure savings with the building utility meters. One advantage of the building utility meter is if multiple conservation measures have savings interactions, then these effects can be captured on the utility meter. For example, poor heating distribution controls caused by residents opening their windows, which increases the heating load. The building heating fuel meter captures the load decrease from distribution controls as well as the load increase from opening the windows. HUD has specific requirements for M&V when using option C. It requires an analysis of potential baseline changes and actual utility consumption every year. For the frozen rolling base, the comparison period is July 1 to June 30th. But for the AOS, for the add-on subsidy, the comparison is a calendar year. Every fifth year for the frozen rolling base and every year for the add-on subsidy incentive, HUD requires the ESCo to perform operational verification of a sample of installed ECM equipment to identify performance issues that might impact utility consumption and to verify that the equipment is still installed. What data do you need to do an option C analysis of savings? Specific option C utility accounts, the HUD approved baselines, the units of consumption in the utility baseline, and the actual future annual utility consumption are major components of the analysis. What data sources are needed to perform an option C savings analysis? The HUD approval letter, the EPC contract, current ESCo M&V reports, and the PHA utility consumption ledgers are all helpful. The format, methodology, and content of these documents may be different because of different authorships and different requirements between the HUD approval letter and the ESCo contract. HUD has even more specific requirements in terms of how the data is presented, which includes its Form 52722 and the documentation of any field office approved adjustments to HUD's baselines. PHAs are also required to document capital fund work that impacts any consumption baselines. When conducting an option C savings analysis, some steps needed include reviewing any project-related sites for baseline adjustments and to make sure that you are using correct HUD-approved utility rates for the savings calculations. There are some baseline adjustments that may be approved by HUD, but these approvals will only come from the HUD original approval letter or based upon a request from the PHA and the ESCo to adjust the baseline, which again must be approved by the field office. Some examples of adjustments are weather adjustments for heating degree days and significant changes in unit occupancy. Key data required from the HUD Form 52722 to help calculate option C savings can be found on line 1, the actual consumption, and line 9 for the base consumption, as well as line 16 for the total cost of utility consumption and line 17 to calculate the average utility rate. To complete an option C savings analysis, you will need to review any HUD required baseline adjustments per amp. You will also need to compare the differences between ESCo baselines and HUD-approved baselines to help calculate the consumption savings. One of the common differences in option C savings analysis between HUD and the ESCo are the utility rates used to calculate the savings. HUD may approve a variety of baseline adjustments. The most common approval for baseline adjustments is during the EPC or the ESCo's baseline development process. HUD must issue a letter approving those adjustments. Those approved baseline adjustments may be used over the contract term. The ESCo or PHA may apply for approval for additional baseline adjustments related to building use changes, water meter changes, or unit occupancy adjustments. But HUD must approve them before the PHA can use them to calculate incentive qualified savings. To maintain savings over time, the key data required are accurate spot measurements of equipment and accurate utility meter data. Also, accurate utility rate information is especially important because these rates can change significantly over time. Effective operation and maintenance of equipment and inspection of equipment condition is also important to monitor significant equipment changes. And last, use clear and accurate savings calculations that provide an adequate written narrative to explain the savings data, the calculations, and tables. Also, it's very important to retain an accurate audit trail for all your calculations. Thank you for attending HUD's Vignette series on energy performance contracting. We hope that this series has been helpful to your understanding of energy performance contracting, and we encourage you to listen to all 8 of the Vignette in this series. You may email any comments or questions to HUD at PIH_EPC_policy@HUD.gov. Thank you for attending and have a great rest of your day.